Good evening everyone, and welcome to my little Halloween special. In the spirit of the spooky season, we will be venturing into a classic Gothic novel, namely Dracula by Bram Stoker, first published in 1897. Anyone who doesn't know Dracula must have been living under a rock, because it's been incredibly popular ever since it first came out. But how many of you know the actual story? Films and TV adaptations have made their own spin of the Dracula story for decades at this point, so much that the original has become a bit of a mystery. But no more. Tonight I will tell you the story as it was originally written. So, why don't you make yourself comfortable with a snack and a beverage of your choice, and let's get into it. The story starts off with the journal of a Jonathan Harker, a young solicitor from England who is travelling to Transylvania. He's on a mission from his firm to meet with a count and explain the legal details of the count's recent purchase of a London property. It is a long journey, and Jonathan arrived at a hotel in a neighbouring village during the night, and he hoped to continue towards the castle the next day. When he revealed where he was going, the couple who were running the hotel started acting strangely, but they refused to answer any questions. And when he left the next day, the woman put a crucifix around his neck, which he thought was quite odd, but he kept it out of politeness. After a long ride through the harsh landscape, the coach arrived at the meeting point where Jonathan was to be picked up by Count Dracula's carriage. The driver had a hat that covered most of his face, but Jonathan noticed a pair of bright eyes that looked red in the lamplight, and when the driver spoke, he appeared to have very sharp-looking teeth. Jonathan then continued alone with the driver towards the castle, and it was anything but a calm ride. Wolves were howling all around them, and Jonathan was, by this point, genuinely frightened. But eventually they arrived at what looked like a ruined old castle with nothing but darkness coming out of its windows. The driver dropped him off at the courtyard, and just as Jonathan started freaking out over being left alone in the dark, the door finally opened. It was a tall, pale man with a long white mustache, completely dressed in black. He welcomed Jonathan and shook his hand, which Jonathan found shockingly strong and cold to the touch. To Jonathan's relief, though, the Count was quite friendly and helped him get settled in a room with a warm fire, after which he was served a nice supper. They went over the papers that Jonathan's firm had sent with him, and afterwards they gathered in front of the fire where Jonathan was offered a cigar. He had a better look at the Count here and found him rather odd-looking. He had unusually pointed teeth which protruded over his lips, as well as pointy ears. It was nearly dawn by the time Jonathan went to bed, and he didn't wake up until late the next day. Dracula was nowhere to be seen, but a breakfast was set up for him in the dining room, so Jonathan ate his fill, after which he decided to go exploring. It struck him as strange, though, that he had yet to see a single staff member at the castle. He found a library with many English books. As he was examining them, Count Dracula entered. They go on to talk about the books, and Dracula admitted that he had been educating himself on all things English in the hopes of being perceived as a native once he moves there, which is also why he wanted Jonathan's help in perfecting his language skills. They go on to talk all night once again and retire to their rooms at dawn. He writes in his journal about something very strange that happened when he was shaving that day. He had been using his own little travel mirror, as there were no other mirrors around in the castle but he could see, and suddenly the Count had come up behind him saying good morning, but Jonathan hadn't seen his reflection. He had been startled by this sudden appearance and accidentally cut himself. The Count's eyes had lit up with a kind of demonic fury, and he lunged towards Jonathan, but when he touched his crucifix, he composed himself again and backed away. He then threw Jonathan's pocket mirror out of the window and left. Jonathan continued his exploring that day, and he found some nice views, but practically all the doors were locked. There was no exit route available anywhere. He was a prisoner. He returned to his room, where he found the Count busy making his bed. This confirmed all his suspicions that there were, after all, no servants in the castle. It was all the Count. A couple more nights follow, with the two of them talking about the Count's upcoming move to England. Jonathan decided to keep his fear to himself, hoping that he would get out of there soon. But that is when the Count tells him to write some letters home, saying that he won't be back for another month. That evening, Jonathan goes to his favorite view spot in the castle and looks outside, and that is when he sees something truly horrifying. He sees Dracula coming out from a window below and crawls down the wall like a lizard. Frightened, Jonathan tries all the doors again, and while they were all of them still locked, he found one that he could pry off the hinges. Inside was an old wing with dusty but extravagant furniture. He sits down there to write in his journal and eventually gets sleepy. As he slumbers in the sofa, he sees 3 women standing by the window looking at him. He finds them strangely alluring, and one of them came up to kiss him, and her kiss tasted like blood. Just as she was about to bite his neck, Dracula came into the room and threw the woman to the side forcefully, saying that Jonathan was his. Jonathan woke up in his own bed, not certain if it had all just been a delirious dream. A couple of nights later, the Count gave him a strange instruction. He was to write 3 letters home with 3 different dates on them that were about 1 month into the future. They were to say things like, "I'm just about to leave the castle now," or "I've just left and I'm now staying at a hotel in the neighboring village," things like that. This confirms to Jonathan that he had about 1 month to find a way to escape, otherwise this would be the end of his life. The weeks go by without any entries in the journal, until eventually Jonathan reports that he had tried to send a coded message to his fiancée back in England, Mina, but the Count had intercepted it and burned it. Then he discovered that all of his writing paper and envelopes were mysteriously gone from his room, as well as his travelling suit. More days go by, and now Jonathan was mostly locked inside his room. All his efforts to contact the outside world had failed. It was time for action, and he decided that he would use the daylight to climb into Dracula's room. He did so with much effort, but found himself in a basically empty room with only a few dusty old items. He then found a door leading down a stairwell into an underground chapel, where, to his horror, he found the Count laying in a pile of old dirt inside a wooden box. He looked neither dead nor sleeping, but completely unresponsive. Jonathan tried to find keys on him, but was so creeped out that he just fled and hurried back to his room. Then the date of his doom arrived, the 30th of June, which was the day when the Count was to begin his travels. In one last effort, Jonathan goes by the window once more to Dracula's resting place in the box in the chapel to try and find keys. But when he looked upon Count Dracula, he found him looking much younger than before. His hair and mustache were a dark grey instead of white, and his cheeks were full and his lips red with blood. He did not find any keys, and later, when some hired people came to pick up the boxes, he was still locked inside, left alone in the castle with 3 women who were thirsting for his blood. We then move over to England, where Jonathan's fiancée Mina is going to the seaside town of Whitby to stay with her friend Lucy. She hasn't heard from Jonathan for a while and is beginning to worry about him. But soon after her arrival there, her friend Lucy began sleepwalking, and Mina had to lock the bedroom door at night to keep her from wandering outside. But then a violent storm came to Whitby, and the newspaper told a shocking story about it the next day. A ship had arrived during the storm, and the only living creature on it had been a big dog that escaped towards the village as soon as the ship came into shore. The captain of the ship was found dead and tied to the wheel, and the logbook told a harrowing tale of the crewmen disappearing one by one during the journey until there was only the captain left. Shortly afterwards, Lucy managed to get outside while sleepwalking, and Mina found her on a bench in the churchyard with a dark figure bent over her. But as soon as she got closer, she found her alone. Mina put a shawl around her and walked her home, where she discovered 2 small prick marks on her neck, but concluded that she must have accidentally pricked her with the safety pin of the shawl. After this incident, Lucy grew significantly weaker, despite Mina locking the door at night and hiding the key. She did, however, find Lucy with her head outside the window a few times. How Mina managed to get any rest is beyond me. Eventually, though, Lucy seemed to be feeling better, just as Mina receives a letter with news of Jonathan. It's already August 19th, so it's been a while since she heard anything. We learn that Jonathan had been sick with brain fever and had been staying at a hospital in Budapest for nearly 6 weeks. And Mina, of course, decides to go there and help nurse him back to health. She writes to Lucy from Budapest, telling her that she and Jonathan had gotten married there. He was still very weak, though, and seemed to suffer from memory loss. He gave her his journal, saying that he didn't want to remember what was in it, and so Mina promises to seal the journal and never open it unless she has to. Back in England, Lucy falls ill again. She's pale and weak and has a lot of pain in her throat. This is when her fiancé Arthur writes to their friend Dr. Seward, asking him to examine her, which he of course did. And what he found was puzzling, to say the least. She showed symptoms of anemia, but as he tested her blood, he found it completely healthy. He then assumed that her illness might be mental and decided to ask his old master for advice, Professor Van Helsing from Amsterdam. And Van Helsing rushed like the wind over to England. He was cryptic in his examination of Lucy and very much concerned, so he went back to Amsterdam to do some more research. Lucy's condition was all right until September 6th, when she suddenly turned critical. So Dr. Seward sent for Van Helsing by a telegram. Van Helsing returned with great haste and determined that they would need to do a blood transfusion. Now, back in those days, blood types and such were not quite known yet, so they decided that the best candidate to give her blood would be somebody who loves her, i.e. her fiancé. So Arthur is summoned, and he gladly gives up some blood to save his beloved. And it seemed to work. Lucy was already doing better the next day. She was conscious, she could talk, and everyone was relieved. But now started the long and dreary cycle of trying to keep Lucy alive. It went on for about 2 weeks, where Van Helsing and Dr. Seward would take turns in guarding Lucy at night, and yet, somehow, whenever there wasn't anyone with her, she was always in critical condition in the morning. She also had puncture marks on her throat that wasn't healing. Van Helsing then filled her whole room with garlic, and for a while that seemed to help, but he was still very cryptic in why this was helping. Eventually, we get to September 17th, when Lucy had trouble sleeping. Her mother came into the room and laid down beside her. But then there was a violent flapping on the window, which eventually broke the window, shattered glass all over the floor, and through the opening, the women saw the head of a wolf peeking inside. They scream, and Lucy's mother consequently dies from a heart attack. There and then, just dies. The maids come in and they all scream, but now the wolf seems to have disappeared, and Lucy tells the maids to go and have a glass of wine to calm themselves from the shock, and that's when she sits down to write this in case she won't live to see the morning. The next morning, Seward sees a telegram from Van Helsing urging him to go and check on Lucy, but he had fallen asleep before receiving it. So he rushed over to Lucy's house, where he finds her at the brink of death. She gets another blood transfusion, this time from their friend Morris, the fourth man to now give blood to poor Lucy. But it is too late. She cannot be saved now. Her fiancé Arthur came over, and they all watched over her until she quietly passed away. Dr. Seward expresses his sadness that her life had to end this way, but Van Helsing corrects him, saying that no, it is only the beginning. Meanwhile, Mina and Jonathan had come back to England as Mr. and Mrs. Harker, and were now living in Exeter, where they had inherited some property. But then they had to go to London for a funeral, and while in London, she and Jonathan were out walking one day, and Jonathan suddenly had a nervous fit. They had seen a tall, pale man close by, and this had upset him for some reason. The man had unusually sharp teeth, but Mina couldn't see why Jonathan would otherwise react this way. After this, he fell asleep on Mina's shoulder and seemed to have no memory of the fit when he woke up again. Mina then decided that perhaps she had to read that journal of his after all. Back at Lucy's house, the undertaker is preparing the death chamber for Lucy and her mother, for their loved ones to come and say their final goodbyes. Van Helsing had also made sure to place garlic in the chamber, as well as a crucifix on Lucy's mouth, and he spent the whole night patrolling outside the chamber. After the funeral, it seems to everyone that the horrible affair was finally over, but Van Helsing is still suspicious. And sure enough, it didn't take long for the newspapers to start reporting of children going missing in the night, only to return weak in the mornings and with wounds on their throats. Back at Mina and Jonathan's, Mina had finally sat down to read Jonathan's journal from his stay in Transylvania, and she was horrified, not knowing if this was real or just the imaginings of his brain fever. This is when she receives a letter from Professor Van Helsing, who informs her of her friend Lucy's death. Van Helsing had read Lucy's journal and letters, so he knew of their close friendship. He also asked if he could meet with Mina, and she agreed. So he takes the train over to Exeter and meets Mina in hers and Jonathan's home. He wanted to know the exact details of Lucy's sleepwalking, as he knew from her journal that it had been Mina who had helped her whenever this happened. So Mina shares her own journal with him, and asks if he wouldn't mind looking at Jonathan's Transylvania journal as well, since Van Helsing was a doctor. Perhaps he could determine whether these were typical delusions of a person with brain fever. He reads them both and assures Mina in a letter sent from his hotel room that the account given by Jonathan in his journal is real. Mina then tells Jonathan, who immediately goes to see Van Helsing to thank him. He feels completely cured of his previous anxiety, having finally been given that confirmation that he wasn't, in fact, completely mad. Van Helsing then has to return to London, so Jonathan follows him to the train. While back in London, Van Helsing and Dr. Seward look at the article about the missing children with the wounds on their throats. Seward is afraid that whatever happened to Lucy is happening to them as well, but Van Helsing corrects him, saying that it is Lucy that is doing it to them. This is of course a bit of a shock for Dr. Seward, but Van Helsing says that he will prove it. So off they go to poor Lucy's grave, barely even a week old. They sneak into her family tomb in the night and break open her coffin, Seward fully expecting to see a rotting corpse there, but alas, the coffin was empty. So they go and keep watch until they see a white figure emerge some hours later, carrying an unconscious child. It is somewhat unclear how, but they get hold of the child without seeing the figure up close, and they immediately take it to where the police would find it. The next day, they return to the tomb, and now Lucy is in her coffin, so beautiful and healthy looking that she might as well be sleeping. Van Helsing then explains that she is an undead and they have to kill her. Van Helsing gets Dr. Seward informed on everything, and the following night they returned with Arthur and Morris, as well as the tools needed to finish her off. The same thing, the coffin is empty, they wait, and she returns with a child whom she feeds on. They confront her and are horrified by what they see. She snarls at them, her eyes blazing with hellfire. There is no trace at all of the sweet Lucy she once was. They let her go back into her coffin, and once she is in her undead sleep, Arthur is given the honor of hammering a stake through her heart. It was gruesome, and she shrieked and trembled as blood was spurting out from her mouth, but then she was restored into a normal human corpse. Van Helsing and Seward go on to take her head off and stuffs her mouth full of garlic to complete the restoration. And all four of them make a promise to take down the master of the undead. After this, Mina and Jonathan arrive in London and they all gather at Dr. Seward's house, which also happens to be the asylum that he runs. Compiling all the information that they have, they find out that Dracula's London mansion is pretty much next door to the asylum. What are the odds of that? So they decide to go on a little scouting mission, meaning Van Helsing, Dr. Seward, Arthur, Morris, and Jonathan. They sneak into the old mansion and find their way to the old chapel. There they find 29 boxes, and they know that Dracula brought 50 with him from Transylvania. Now, these boxes are filled with a special kind of earth that Dracula can rest in, so they realize that he must have spread the rest of the boxes all around London, which gives him plenty of safe house options. They get back to the asylum in the morning, and Jonathan finds Mina quite exhausted, so he lets her sleep while he investigates where the other earth boxes might be. and finds out that some boxes had been delivered to a house in Piccadilly. So Jonathan and the others discuss the possibility of breaking in there. The goal is to sterilize the earth boxes with holy wafers, otherwise called sacramental bread, because Dracula cannot enter the earth if that is in there. That night, one of the patients of the asylum gets mysteriously attacked, and Dr. Seward and his orderlies are tending to him. The patient reveals that his attacker had come for Mrs. Harker, meaning Mina. So they rush to the Harker's room, where they find Jonathan unconscious in a kind of trance, and Mina is in the arms of Count Dracula himself. He had been drinking from her neck and apparently forced her to drink from him as well. They take up their crucifixes and he turns into a mist and flees out the window. Mina is sobbing and Jonathan is disoriented as he wakes up from his trance. As Mina recalls what had happened, she said that Dracula had reproached her for working against him, and that she will now become his helper and companion, the kin of his kin. The next morning they decided to hunt down Dracula's other lairs, starting with the one in Piccadilly. Mina was to stay behind, however, and Van Helsing put a sacramental bread on her forehead for protection, but it burned her and left a big red scar. Time was of the essence, as her transformation had already begun. So they all go to the Piccadilly house, where they break in with the help of a locksmith, and conveniently enough, they find all of Dracula's administrative records, including addresses and keys to all his other houses. So Arthur and Morris take those and run off, whereas Van Helsing, Jonathan and Dr. Seward go on to sterilize the boxes in the Piccadilly house. But then Dracula shows up, and Jonathan tries to ambush him with a knife, but he was too fast and fled through the window. Back at the asylum that evening, we learn that all the boxes had been sterilized aside from one. So this is when Mina gets an idea. She can feel herself being connected to Dracula, and so she asks Van Helsing to hypnotize her. He does, and through this Mina could spy on what Dracula is doing, and they find out that he is in his last Earth box on a ship. So he's fleeing London, and they decide to run after him. After a bit of investigating, they find out that Dracula is on a ship bound for Varna in Bulgaria. So they all pack up and get to Varna before the ship's scheduled arrival. There they wait in anticipation, with Van Helsing doing regular hypnosis on Mina to make sure that Dracula was still on the ship. But the days go by and no ship from London arrived. Mina's behavior was starting to change. She would speak very little and sleep most of the day. Time really was of the essence. Eventually, they get a report that the ship will not actually come to Varna, but will go directly to Galatz in Romania. So they hop on a train to Galatz, but they arrive too late. The ship had already docked and the cargo had been taken off. Dracula must have hired workers to help him get back to his castle. So they analyze all the travel routes to the castle and decide to split up. Jonathan and Arthur rent a boat and go by the river. Dr. Seward and Morris take one route by horse, and Mina and Van Helsing take another route, also by horse. They travel like this for several days, during which Mina starts to change even more. She stops eating and she looks really sickly, and the villagers they come across seem really frightened of her. Eventually, they close in on the castle. They make camp on the hill in the snow, and Van Helsing drew a circle around them using sacramental bread. That night, they were visited by 3 vampire women that came down from the castle. They beckoned the terrified Mina to come with them, calling her sister. But they couldn't get to her, and she couldn't get to them, as they couldn't pass through the circle. They waited there until dawn, when Van Helsing then walked up to the castle and found his way down to the chapel crypts, using the description from Jonathan's diary. There he finds the 3 vampire women sleeping in boxes, and he kills them off one by one and sterilized the crypt. He also blocked the entrance so that Dracula couldn't even get into the castle, and then he went back to Mina. They waited the rest of the day until they saw a carriage approaching up the hill. It was the hired workers, seemingly rushing to get the box to the castle before sundown. Close behind them were both Jonathan, Arthur, and Morris, shouting at them to halt, but they were ignored. So they drew their weapons and a fight broke out on the hill. The sun was setting any second now, meaning that Dracula would be able to wake up from his box and fight them. They fought off the workers, and Jonathan pried open the box and he attacked Dracula's neck, whereas Morris went for the heart. And just as the sun set, Dracula was turned to dust. Morris had unfortunately been wounded in the attack, and he bled out there on the hill. Mina, however, was now cured from her curse and could now leave the holy circle. She and Jonathan went on to live happily ever after, and they named their son after their fallen friend Quincy Morris. The end. So this was a rather difficult one to summarize. It is an epistolary novel, meaning that the story is made up of journals and letters, and I don't really have a great track record with those. The beginning is really good though, when we follow only Jonathan Harker during his stay at the castle in Transylvania. I would even go as far as calling it a masterpiece. I didn't think it would even be possible for me to feel creeped out by Dracula, as it's been so overdone to the point where it really isn't scary anymore. But this first section of the book was a little bit scary. I was happily surprised by that. But then the story moves over to England and everything gets a little bit jumbled. We switch between Lucy, Mina, and Dr. Seward a lot. Sometimes we only get one paragraph in one POV before it changes again, which made it a little challenging to summarize, but it's still a good read that holds up surprisingly well. My only disappointment was the ending. It felt really rushed. That last fight where they kill Dracula and Morris dying, it all happened on the last page, pretty much. I would have preferred the heroes fighting Dracula himself rather than some nameless helpers of his, especially as we had so much build-up to that last fight. Or that Dracula managed to escape somehow and the ending would be a bit ambiguous. He died so quickly that I thought that was what happened at first, but then it was made clear that Mina was cured from her curse, so he had to have died then. Just a bit unsatisfying in my view. But I would like to know what all of you watching think. Have you read the book or only seen one of the many adaptations? And which one is your favorite in that case? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to give the video a thumbs up as well, and subscribe if you enjoy this type of content. So, thank you all so much for watching tonight, and I hope to see you back next time.